Today, my wife and I are visiting Colonial Williamsburg, an amazing living history museum in Virginia that tells the early part of America's enduring story. Come along with me and my wife as we explore a history buff's paradise. That's coming up next.
Welcome to the most important building in Williamsburg. That's this one behind me here. This is the Capitol, which is really the reason that Williamsburg existed in the first place. Because Williamsburg was originally a planned capital city. This is a 1934 reconstruction of the Capitol building, where Virginia's government met for most of the 18th century. It's on the same spot as the original, which was finished back in 1705, 6 years after Virginia decided in 1699 move their seat of government away from Jamestown, where it had been since 1607, and lay out a new capital city in this area. They named after their king at the time, William III. Unfortunately, the first capital burned in 1747, so they erected a second capital to replace it on the same spot. That was completed a few years later in the 1750s. That second capital was still standing in 1780 when Virginia's government moved to Richmond. Eventually, in 1832, what was left of the second capital also burned. But both buildings were laid out essentially the same way, in the shape of a huge capital letter H. On one side of the H, the near side here, were the king's representatives in Virginia's government. On the opposite side, the people's representatives. The English thought of their government as an ongoing conversation between the king and the people, with the king having the final say in that conversation, of course. Speaking for the king on this side would be the royal governor, sent from England to speak for the king, Virginia's government. When he arrived here, he wouldn't necessarily be familiar with how things were done in Virginia. So the king also appointed 12 Virginia gentlemen known as counselors to assist the governor. The royal governor and 12 counselors together made up the king's side of Virginia's government. On the opposite side, we have the elected House of Burgesses. Those gentlemen, at least in theory, spoke for the people of Virginia. I say in theory because they weren't democratically elected in the modern sense, but they were an elected body, and each county in Virginia elected 2 burgesses. Frequent regular elections called by the royal governor. They would come here to Williamsburg, counties all over Virginia, bringing with them complaints and petitions from the people of their counties for the legislature to consider. Sometimes during a session, representatives from both sides might meet in the neutral middle of the gate, up on the second floor, in a joint committee. A few counselors and a few burgesses might get together to try and resolve their disagreements over a particular bill. If they could do that, they would pass it on to the royal governor, who could veto it if he disapproved. But even if the governor approved the bill, remember it is the king who has the final say in the conversation. So that bill did not become law in the colony until it had been sent across the ocean 3,000 miles away to England to meet the king's approval. That could take a while. It could take a year, sometimes more. Sometimes we might never get an answer back, and that could be inconvenient, but for most of the colonial period, British Americans liked being British. They believed they had a better government and enjoyed more liberty than any other people in the world. After all, only the English colonies had elected legislatures as part of their government. None of the other European colonies had that. And they were also proud of the justice system. the English common law. In fact, the first room we're going to see is the general courtroom. So, we are in the general courtroom of the Capitol. This is where the highest court in Virginia can meet. They were the only court with the authority to try 3 persons for felony crimes, such as murder, house burning, horse stealing, grand larceny. The nearby public jail would be open prisoners brought from all over Virginia to await their trial in this court. This court will be in session 4 times a year, 2 to 4 months. So if you're in one of the outlying counties and you're brought here accused of a felony, you might be waiting for your trial for a couple of months. But once the trial got underway, it didn't last long at all. Usually only a few minutes. So more than 15 minutes. Criminal justice is very swift in colonial courts. There are a lot of factors contributing to that. One is the fact that you would be standing trial. Now we still use that expression today, but they meant it in the 18th century. When you stood trial, that means you were standing up the whole time. This is where you would stand trial, right here. Center of this room, which they call the bar. The bar separated court officers from anyone who was not. So, if you're not a court officer, you're not allowed to do this. I just passed the bar. I passed the bar, and you are the bailiff's view was rather harsh here. So everybody out here was a bystander, not a bysitter. These benches you're sitting on would not be here. But you folks are actually historically authentic. You're standing, not sitting. Yes. If you had witnesses testifying for you, when they were called, they would come up to the bar and take the stand next to you. Of course, everybody knows witnesses don't take the sit. They take the stand. They did that in colonial courts. So that's one factor contributing to a swift trial, a speedy trial, which, by the way, is still a right, a constitutional right in our American Constitution. Now, another factor in swift trial is the fact that you're probably not going to have a lawyer representing you. Public defenders didn't become universal in this country until 1963. Over here is where the lawyers would be, including the King's attorney who prosecute all the criminal cases for the Crown. You need defense attorneys. As for those who can afford them, you see, if you lost your case, you had to pay the lawyers on both sides. So to keep your potential court costs down, you might find it wise. I think many did, most did, when you think that. You just represent yourself, which you have the right to do. Whether they won or whether they lost, lawyers were paid 50 shillings a case here in the High Court. That's £2.50. So if you've got to pay 2 lawyers, that's £5. The average American tradesman at this time is earning between 25 and 30 pounds in a year. £5 of that, that's a big chunk of change for ordinary Virginians here. So you're representing yourself, standing the whole time. But, of course, as a free British subject, you did have some rights. This is what made them proud of the justice system. The burden of proof is on the prosecution. They had to prove that you did it. You didn't have to prove that you didn't do it. You have the right to face your accusers, to know what you're being accused of, call witnesses in your favor, cross-examine witnesses against you. Most important of your rights, the right to choose who will judge you. Now, of course, up on that bench there, you have the royal governor and at least 4 of his 12 counselors. One thing we never do in colonial Virginia courts is subject people to the opinions of just one judge. There's only one judge, or if he doesn't like you, you figure that wouldn't be just at all. So the governor and these 4 of the counselors had to be present in the court session. You could have more than 4 counselors. you could have all 12 of them present. That happens sometimes. Rare cases, with important cases. But nevertheless, in that minimal quorum was 4 plus the governor. Even in local county courts in Virginia, there had to be at least 4 local justices present. Local county courts met once a month. They actually had the authority to try enslaved persons or felons. And even the enslaved were not subjected to the opinions of just one judge. An enslaved person was on trial for a felony in local court. There had to be at least 5 justices present, not just 4. Now, most of the time, simple majority sufficed for the decisions. Of course, these counselors are extremely wealthy men. They own thousands of acres of land. They're what were known as gentlemen. Yeah. Being a nice guy with good manners didn't make you a gentleman in 18th century society. You had to be rich enough not to have to do any manual work for a living. These rich counselors here own thousands of acres of land. Even more important, they own plenty of enslaved labor to work their land. So they don't have to do any manual work. That also means they have a lot of time on their hands. So they need something to do with all that time, right? Of course. That's why they were regarded as a governing class. Running the government, I believe, is one of the most honorable things these rich gentlemen could be doing with their time. And how many do you think you'd like to be judged in court by a panel of rich gentlemen slave owners who don't have to do any manual work? So you want to be shaking your heads there. Well, fortunately, the English common law gives you another option. If you're a free subject, you can also choose to be judged by 12 ordinary men from your neighborhood who work with their hands for a living, just like you. A jury of your peers. They too were considered court officers performing their duties. This is where they would sit here. This is inside the bar here. They had to meet some qualifications. They had to be adult white males. They had to be Protestant. Anybody here a Roman Catholic? Yeah, it's best not to let the authorities know about that. Most British colonies. Had to own at least a modest amount of property. It didn't have to be thousands of acres like these rich counselors, but a small farm of at least 25 acres with a house on it would suffice. If you own property, this means you can't just up and leave any old time. This means you've been living in one place for a while. You've gotten to know your neighbors. And that's another qualification of jurors, that they know the character of the person on trial, which is totally the opposite of what we expect of jurors today. Well, how can they judge you if they don't know you? Might be their question. They thought of jurors as a panel of character witnesses. In the selection process, you could issue up to 19 perimeter challenges before jurors were sworn. You might even be able to get at least some of your friends on the jury. They might be able to convince the others that you're not guilty. But they would have to do it fast, because after the trial, they were not allowed to leave until they had reached a unanimous verdict. Hung juries were not allowed. A simple majority wasn't sufficient, as it was for the governing council. They might be asked to deliberate right here in front of spectators. There could be a lot of spectators. This is the only place in the whole colony where you get to see 3 persons being put on trial for hanging offenses. And death wasn't the penalty for all felons, including non-violent ones, such as picking pockets and stealing horses. They can't reach a verdict here. They might be sent to another room and sequestered there. They were not allowed any fire, candle, food, or drink until they reached the unanimous verdict. So that's another factor that made for swift justice there. 15 minutes was usually considered a long time for juries to spend deliberating. Now, judiciary power is not the only power that the governing council had. The council also sat as the upper house of the legislature. It had to approve any bill before it could become a law. They also acted as the cabinet of the government. They could influence his executive decisions through their advice. Just imagine one person in the American government today, being a cabinet member, a senator, and a Supreme Court judge. all at the same time. You have roughly similar powers to one of the counselors. Imagine the president being Supreme Court Chief Justice at the same time as president. You have roughly similar powers to a royal government. That's one thing that the Americans agreed needed to change in 1776 when it broke away from England. No one person should have that much power all at once. They also agreed that the English common law is one of the good things about the old government. So they agreed, let's keep that. And that's still the basis for our American justice system today.
Well, that's a wrap for this Colonial Williamsburg video. I hope you really enjoyed it, getting to see another part of this amazing living history museum. If you like this sort of stuff, check out my other videos. Check out colonialwilliamsburg.org to plan your own visit here, because it's so much cooler in real life than it is on film. Till next time, this is History Buff, TN Photobug signing out, and I'm having a blast with the past.